In March of 2022, the Ukrainian government said that about 3,000 Americans had volunteered to fight alongside Ukraine in their war against Russia. One of them was Trevor Reed, a former U.S. Marine who spent 3 years in a Russian prison. He caught tuberculosis, he lost 50 pounds, and when he was released and returned home to the United States, he started training. Just 6 months after being released from Russian prison, Reed smuggled himself into Ukraine to fight against the Russians. This week on Afterwards, Trevor Reed talks about his memoir titled Retribution, a former U.S. Marine's harrowing journey from wrongful imprisonment in Russia to the front lines of the Ukrainian war. This is Afterwards from C-SPAN. This week, a former U.S. Marine, Trevor Reed, talks about his imprisonment in Russia, his time fighting on the front lines in Ukraine, and his efforts to counter Russian propaganda. He is joined by the co-author of his memoir, Jim DeFelice, and former U.S. Ambassador to Russia, John Sullivan. They spoke at Georgetown University in February of 2026.
So Trevor, I was just talking to your father, Joey, and I asked him this question, which has, since the very first day I heard about your case, I've struggled with. Why you? Why did the Russians, why did you wind up in IK-12? You obviously hadn't done what they charged you with. They didn't accuse you of being a spy, the way they did Paul Whelan. You weren't an extraordinarily wealthy, influential business person like Michael Calvi, another American who was wrongfully detained, or a gold medal winning Olympic basketball player like Brittany Griner, Wall Street Journal reporter, et cetera. You get the drift. Why you? Why do you think what happened to you, which is so compellingly told, why you?
I think that, Russia just kind of stumbled onto that. I was already in the police station. By that point, I was drunk in a park with my girlfriend. That's not illegal in Russia. That's more like national pastime. But
it's not very uncommon.
But in the morning they released me to go home. I wasn't put in a cell. I wasn't arrested, detained, anything, fined even. But in the morning the shift changed, and when that new shift came on, that police chief decided maybe I was worth something, and contacted the director of the FSB. And after that, things went downhill pretty quick.
Why so? So you can imagine, just in the United States, you can imagine somebody getting arrested, precinct captain at a police precinct looks at him sideways. Eventually, the system recognizes that this person doesn't belong, sort of like antibodies, and spits you out of the system. Why did the Russian justice system suck you in? And to the extent that you were sentenced to 9 years at hard labor, people who commit murders don't get sentences that long in Russia. Okay, you got picked up, whatever happened at the police precinct happened. Why did the justice system then continue to absorb you and make you this target?
Initially I thought, I was really worried that during the initial court process they had seen a picture of me with the president. But I found out later through other sources that that wasn't the case, and pretty much as soon as the FSB became aware of me, they decided that I was going to be a political pawn there. So I think it really comes down to your military service. So inside of Russia, people are very aware what Americans think about U.S. Marines. They're aware of the reputation there. And I'm guessing, especially after having already taken Paul Whelan, another U.S. Marine, that they knew that would be somebody that the United States would value.
There's another point, actually, that the ambassador also was kind of alluding to, in that in America, if the prosecution, they realize somewhere in that system, someone recognizes that there's an injustice or a mistake, they will prevail. They will not be suffering dire consequences for setting things right. Whereas in Russia, in the system that you were caught in, no one dared to say that there had been a mistake, because the consequences for them may very well have been worse than the consequences for you.
Yeah, right. It's here in the United States, if the system is designed so that we're not going to expend resources to keep someone, the Russian equivalent of you in the United States, not a spy, not an illegal. Why would we keep someone like you, the Russian equivalent, for 9 years? The cost, the expense, and what became clear to me almost immediately upon my arrival in Moscow was, before you or Paul were convicted, the Russian media, which means the Russian government through the media, is asking me, well, what kind of trade can you do?
Sure. I want to be really clear about that, because I think, and this came up a lot in talks about, whether or not the U.S. should participate in a prisoner exchange. So there's kind of this broad view in the United States that these countries, not just Russia, Venezuela, Syria, Iran, places like that will take Americans for the sole purpose of doing this one-for-one prisoner exchange. And in some cases, if you're talking about non-state actors, you're talking about a terrorist organization, criminal groups, that very well could happen. But as far as states, and especially states as large and as powerful as Russia, asking, to get something out of detaining this American, that's more of a secondary effect. So they have a lot broader strategic goals whenever they take Americans hostage than just saying, oh, we want to get this one guy out of there. That could be for domestic signaling, so they could be showing to their own citizens inside of Russia that they have the agency to compel the United States to do something. That could be retaliation for what they view as the wrongful detention or extradition of their own citizens. So there's multiple strategic reasons for why Russia would want to do something like that. And if, in addition to those strategic, reasons, they can get a material concession out of it, then they will do so.
It's worth it to hold you then.
Absolutely.
Even though there'd be criticism from not just U.S. media, but international media as well. Jim, how does, you've dealt with a lot of veterans, you've obviously collaborated in telling their stories. Give us your impression of Trevor's story and how it compares to, similar to, or differs from those other Americans whose stories you've told.
Well, those other Americans weren't held by enemy forces on unfair charges. I mean, number one. One thing that was common for all of them is that before they were thrust into greatness, they were ordinary people. Trevor had a very impressive record as a Marine, but I think he'd be the first one to tell you that he wasn't a hero. And until he was thrown into the gulag, he didn't have the opportunity really to show really what he's made of, and to show that spirit, that incredible spirit of not only survival. I mean, he didn't just survive, a terrible time in a prison. He defied his captors. He stood up to them when truly it would have been so much easier to just go along. And I mean, that kind of spirit, that's the kind of spirit that we look for. I think we all hope for it in ourselves, but we read stories about whether it's Chris Kyle or Henry Langry here, or World War II heroes or whatever. And the thing that's remarkable to me is that these guys, not only were they heroes, not only, at the end of the day, Trevor's, also a hero, but before then, they weren't. And I think that's hopeful for us. We can be heroes too, if we can just persevere and answer our best instincts.
Yeah, the old saying about adversity, not building character, but revealing it, right? I recall, and you write about this in the book, it was a very, it was a telling moment for me and really emotional. You were still you may have been in IK-12, and you said to me, it was toward the end of our conversation, you said, you were telling me about how you were resisting and you weren't working, and I wasn't there to tell you you should work. As I recall, my advice was something along the lines of sort of the advice you hear in the mafia movies: you got to do what you got to do, right, to survive on the inside. But I didn't want to see you, something catastrophic happen to you.
We should actually explain that, because I don't know that everyone has read the book or so. When you are a prisoner in a Russian gulag, in the gulag system, you are expected to work, and Trevor did not work, and the consequences are pretty dire, and we won't go into them. You can read about them, hopefully read about them in the book. Pick up the book.
They're called labor camps for a reason.
Yes.
And they have factories attached to them where the inmates are not only expected but required to work. So you were among, I don't know that there was any other American I ran across who was as uncooperative with the administration of the Russian prison system as you were, to your credit. And I was concerned about your welfare, but I got the sense you thought that, I might be asking these questions because I was concerned that something would embarrass the United States. And you said to me very quietly, I won't, toward the end of our conversation, by the by, I promise you I won't do anything to embarrass the United States. And I had spent the previous 5 years, either as deputy secretary or as ambassador, spending all day, every day, dealing with people who wanted something from me, who weren't telling me that they were going to give me something, give me an assurance like, I'm an American patriot. I won't do anything to embarrass the United States. So I remember coming back to the embassy and telling our team, the country team, like, this kid he's worth a you-know-what, and we gotta make sure we do all we can for every American, but that was a pretty extraordinary thing. So when did you come to the realization that you had to have that type of attitude to survive? When did you realize that it was that bad that you had to risk your health, a hunger strike, violent response from the prison administration if you were going to make it through this ordeal?
It wasn't so much about, in the case of resisting survival, obviously, if you cooperate with the Russian government, your stay in detention will be a lot easier than mine was. But they'll have things that you want to do. One of those things is requiring you to work, and I resisted against that because I thought that would be unethical to work, for a foreign government who was wrongfully detaining Americans. I didn't want to, participate in anything that was going to be used to help an enemy of the United States. So that was my main reason for resisting there. Other things, they'll try to get you to make propaganda videos, which either kind of, cheapen how brutal the prison system is in there, or to criticize the United States. I was not going to do any of those things. And that wasn't really so much about survival. Something you have to understand about being there is you're not just fighting these battles by yourself. You have the whole weight of the United States on you, and having that weight on you makes it easier to resist, knowing that you're trying to represent a whole country.
Jim, I don't know, my reaction was, I felt this echo of the American POWs in Vietnam, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a tremendous parallel. there's different strategies, and we talk about a few of the strategies that Trevor used in the book, and we don't go into too much detail, but I would take a guess that that our military people will be using some of those techniques, again, for resistance. It's one thing to go into a situation and be patriotic and have that training, and another thing to persevere and keep up with it when, again, as you'll read in the book, I'll see how many plugs I can get in for the book. You're essentially near death. I mean, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm a witness. I saw him in IK-12 at the
Right.
depths, and he really looked. There was a fear. Trevor, you write about this in the book, that you had tuberculosis. I now cite it as an example of how terrible the U.S. government is at doing medical diagnoses from a long distance. So there are always people asking me, is Putin sick? There's a rumor he's got cancer. I go back 20 years, the U.S. government thought Fidel Castro was going to die in a matter of months, and starting in August of 2006, he had cancer. But there was a real concern that you had tuberculosis, which is not uncommon in Russian labor camps. And there were inmates at IK-12 who had gotten sick with TB. Did you think that how close did you think you were coming to making there being an end to your resistance with you're sacrificing yourself? How close do you think you got?
I think if I had to estimate, probably I had 6 to 9 months.
If you had continued on that path for 6 to 9 months.
Yeah, I think I would have died within 6 to 9 months if I really fought, maybe 9 months.
Because you write about these two figures that you communicated with in solitary, whom you didn't see until, as I recall, it was at the end of your tenure. And these were two inmates in the solitary confinement area of IK-12, and they were able to communicate, and the story is really well told in the book about how the inmates in solitary confinement were able to communicate. There was one inmate in per small cell. But then you finally, you imagine them as these, based on the timbre of their voice and all they'd done to survive in solitary, that there were these hulking, heroic figures, and then you finally got to see them at the end. And what did you see?
Yeah, they were, to me, I would talk to these guys through the ventilation ducts in solitary confinement. Later, they taught me how to send messages out through the bars to other cells. So you could, even though you're in solitary confinement, you could still always communicate with somebody. How difficult that was another matter. But, after getting to know these guys for months in there, like Ambassador Sullivan was saying, I kind of just had this image of them as being these, giant, gods of resistance. And I got called to a commission to, evaluate how long I was going to be put back into solitary confinement for. And some of those guys were on the same commission. And when I saw them in person, they were just shrunken skeletons and just pale from never having, saw the sun for years. Physically just weak, but, on the inside, just incredible strength.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
I know you talk about the recruiting that Wagner and Yevgeny Prigozhin did in the Russian prison system to get so-called volunteers to fight in Ukraine. And they came to IK-12, right? And you know that some of those detainees who signed contracts to serve in Ukraine didn't survive. So you have some means of, people you met while you were incarcerated, whether it was in CISO or in IK-12, whatever happened. And you write about this, and we'll get into that, about your comrades in Ukraine. But I'm wondering about in the Russian criminal justice system, in CISO, the people you met in CISO or in IK-12?
I'll just say that a long time after I was there, I was in Ukraine, and my dad had contact with one of the prisoners that was in there. He spoke English. He was a foreigner. But he had told my dad that Wagner Group came to IK-12. They had recruited 8 guys. Out of those 8 guys, I knew 2 of them. And within, I believe, maybe 2 weeks, all of them had been killed in action in Ukraine, which was, kind of a concerning moment for me because I was fighting in Ukraine and Donbass at that point. So I hoped, I wouldn't run into them.
Yeah, exactly. And you write about that in the book. Let's start to shift then to Ukraine. The title of your book is telling, Retribution. You're up front about your feelings about what the Russian criminal justice system, the Russian government did to you. I wonder if you could take a step back. Give us the advantage you have now of being several years removed. Look back on Russia, Russians, and let's try to separate the government out a little bit, Putin and his regime. What are your feelings toward Russia now?
Yeah, my feelings towards Russia, as far as the government goes, have not changed much. But I will say that, as much as Russia's in the news and it's easy to hate, Russia as a country, it's important to remember that one of the biggest, victims of the Russian government throughout the years has been the Russian people. And, regardless of what situation I was in there, whether that was, battling through the court systems, resisting inside of prison, or even on the front lines in Ukraine, there were always Russian people there that were doing the right thing, even whenever it was extremely difficult under their personal circumstances.
It's interesting, and I've seen this in your case and with other Americans, Michael Calvi, Paul Whelan, others, the relationships that they developed with Russian inmates. You in particular became kind of a celebrity, right? Because you were both an American, and you were really, from their point of view, to borrow an expression from the 60s and 70s, sticking it to the man, right? I mean, you were on a hunger strike, and they're like giving you fist bumps, go, brother. So it's give us some insight into that culture in the Russian prison system.
The prisoners that were in there were very supportive of my campaign, to resist and fight against the government inside of prison, but that wasn't because of the same reasons. I did that because I didn't want to support an enemy of the United States. I hated what they were doing to Americans, to our country, and that was my purpose for resisting. But inside of the Russian mafia system, they have that same value, but for a different reason. So, their value is we have to fight against the government because that's our internal enemy. And so by doing that, for a different reason, the result was the same. And so I had, pretty widespread support there inside.
Well, so much support that if you ever actually need a job, Mafia has a good position open for you. And it pays very well.
So tell us your thinking as you've got this mindset that allows you to make it through this extraordinary trauma in CISO 5 and in IK-12. In your thinking, when does that convert into the idea of, because while you're incarcerated in IK-12, the Russian Federation launches an aggressive war against Ukraine on February 24th. A few months after that, you're then released, traded for a Russian, Konstantin Yaroshenko. Give us some insight into your thinking then, because you later that year go to, or early the following year, I'm going to lose track of the calendar here, 23 into 24, go to Ukraine to fight. How did you make that transition from prison resistor to active combatant against Russia in Ukraine. What prompted that?
It's several things, and it was, so I went to Ukraine November 1st of 22. I was released in April of 22, and then I fought...
I'm sorry, that's right, 22. I'm getting my years wrong, 22.
Oh, that's okay. And then I fought until August, or I think it was like July 31st, something like that. I got wounded, and then was in the hospital for a couple of months. But as far as that decision to go, part of that was, my whole life had become about fighting this government and about resisting. And, when you get suddenly released from that war doesn't just end for you. That continued for me. And part of that was, I had this feeling every day. I could not sleep more than 3 or 4 hours a day. I had this feeling hanging over me the entire time that, Russia had gotten away with that. They hadn't paid a price, and they were going to continue to do that with impunity. So, there was a personal element. I felt that I couldn't be myself unless the Russian state faced justice for what they were doing there. The other part is I felt I had an ethical obligation to go. I knew what the Ukrainians must be going through if that's how the Russians were treating their own people inside of prison. I felt like if I didn't do that, that would be a conscious choice not to go. When I knew I could help, I had the training and experience to go as a Marine, as a contractor. And the third part of it was ultimately, if the US was not going to impose a geopolitical cost on Russia, then I would do that myself.
And willing to make that personal sacrifice, because obviously you weren't going to turn the tide in this resistance by Ukraine. It was important for your psyche to continue seek that retribution, and that's how you find your way to Ukraine. I didn't have a stroke. I do remember my dates. I left Moscow in September 2022. You had been home in April. The war had started in February. You're on the front lines then. You find your way to Ukraine, and it's an excellent tale in the book, as I've often thought and asked, people I've met who have gone to fight in Ukraine, how they actually find their way there, and it's well told in the book, and it wasn't an easy path to take. It involves carrying a lot of duffel bags with equipment into Ukraine, trains and buses and so forth. But you get there, and you're there during what had been hyped, particularly in the West, in the United States, about what was going to be the spring offensive by the Ukrainians in 2023. Tell us about the Ukrainians you met and their mindset in the spring of 2023 when you start your military service there.
Sure. So I was in a special operations unit under the main intelligence directorate of Ukraine. One of the big jobs that we had was basically the equivalent of what would be in the US called foreign internal defense, which is, training partner forces how to conduct certain military operations. So we were constantly in contact with the Ukrainians doing that. In addition, we would be sent to reinforce Ukrainian regulars that were already in defensive positions and basically instruct them on how to better prepare those defenses and then assist them in combat whenever they came into contact. And talking to those Ukrainians on the ground, all of them had just a ton of gratitude that, we were there as Americans or as foreigners. And, sometimes they would cry and say, thank you for coming here when, there's men in our own country who won't fight. But, I frequently ran into this question, and it was, why is the United States not doing more? And their opinion was, if the United States wanted to, they could crush Russia. They could give us what we need, and we could do it ourselves. So why haven't they done that? And, I really felt that sentiment, and I've sort of had that same question, and I tried to, kind of defend the United States, but, in the end, I made the point that, regardless of what the United States does, there will always be Americans here who will go help, and they seemed to think that was important.
Yeah, tell us about your experience on the ground then in combat with your unit, Rogue Team, which was, I don't know if Westerners is quite accurate, but we'll call not all Americans, some former Marines, who are attached to Ukrainian fighting units, or at least supporting them in their work. What comes through in the book to me as I read it, it was an interesting, it reminded me of, if you've ever read Stephen Crane's book, Red Badge of Courage, Civil War book, right? And he writes movingly, the lead character thinks he's this heroic figure in what turns out to be the Battle of Chancellorsville, right? And he's wounded, he leads a charge, and later at the end of the book, he finds out that, well, the Battle of Chancellorsville was really going on somewhere else. He was involved in some skirmish that nobody ever heard of. I get that sense that it must have been difficult for you, but tell us, it seemed as though you had to struggle to find an opportunity to put your skills to use to support the Ukrainians. And how did it feel to you on, serving there? Did you feel as though the service you were willing to provide was well utilized? Give us your perspective on the battlefield.
I think, it is exactly how you said it. It's very difficult which is just very counterintuitive. You would think it would be very easy. They're in a full-scale war. You could go, fight wherever. They would love to put you there. There's still a lot of bureaucracy that you have to get through there. To get to Rogue Team, even just to get there, I had to do several months of training to do a special operations training course. Then I had to get a security clearance. Then I had to get assigned to a team. Then you have logistics you have to deal with. So, going through all of those things, depending on what unit you're sent to and then what AO, what area of operations you're in, really makes a difference on what type of combat you're going to see and then also what type of missions you're going to do. So, for example, Rogue Team before I got there was fighting in the middle of Bakhmut, and a lot of guys on my team still had combat footage from those battles, and that was like nothing I've ever seen. That looked like, beyond most battles, which I've seen that were filmed in World War II. And so to go from that into, this area that we were operating in and the missions that we were conducting, I've heard this from 100 guys there, and they say, you always want more. You always know someone who's done more than you have, and you always want to get there, but whenever you do, there's somebody else who's always done more. So.
Jim, give us your perspective. Having worked with as many veterans as you've had, presumably serving in the United States military in more conventional terms, if I could use that expression, compare Trevor's service to those.
I think in a lot of ways, what you're talking about with the Crane book is absolutely the experience of most Americans, most soldiers. You don't know, you're involved in a very, very intense part of action, but you don't have that, the overall point of view. And, you're fighting, you're not necessarily, you may have gone into the Army or the Marines or the Navy for patriotic reasons, but when it comes down to it, you're fighting for the fellow to your right or the woman to your left, and that's so I think that part of the experience, the hurry up and wait stuff that Trevor went through, is very typical. On the other hand, the thing that's always amazed me, and this was true also even in Iraq and elsewhere, is the juxtaposition, which we talk about a little bit, between the civilian world and the front. In Trevor's case, you can see that basically the vehicle going from the village where, admittedly, life is not normal, but They are, there's civilians, there's jobs and things. And then you transition in the space of a few kilometers to hell on earth. And that, unfortunately, is the nature of that war, certainly.
Yeah. Tell us about the relationships you developed with your comrades on Team Rogue. You're right, it's really quite a moving story.
Yeah, so, you're with those guys every day at the safe house, conducting training for partner forces there, conducting combat operations. And you really, you get to know all of those guys, and they're your friends, they're your teammates, but they're your friends. But, no matter how close of friends we were, I just felt like I wasn't really one of them, because I had gone there, I had personal reasons for going, and all of those guys that I was fighting with, they went there just to go help. They didn't have the experience that I did with Russia. They didn't have a reason as much as I did to go fight, but those guys chose to go do that anyway. And so whenever I looked at them, I tried to see them as my friends, but I saw them as heroes.
Yeah, it's a different perspective, right? I mean, you're there for retribution, right? You want to really take it to the Russians. What if there had been a negotiated settlement as you arrive, and what were you going to do to get your retribution? Unfortunately, it didn't happen, but you're motivated in ways that are different from the other, at least some of the other Team Rogue comrades, where they're looking to defend the Ukrainians, looking for justice for what happened, for the massacres in Bucha and Mariupol, etc. How did your outlook, the fact that you were really there to, as you were in IK-12, you were really looking to stick it to the Russian man? How did that differentiate you, or did it, from your fellow soldiers who were there looking to defend Ukraine?
I think it made a big difference for me. So, like I said, those guys were my friends, but I really tried to see them just as my friends and my teammates. But really, when I looked at them, I thought, like, these guys are actually heroes, and to fight next to them in combat, I'm just not going to be able to explain what that was like. That's something you have to feel. But I think to them, they didn't really have that. They just, I think, saw me as like just one of the boys. Right.
Well, before we get to the audience questions, Jim, any further thoughts on Trevor in Ukraine?
I think we should mention, since I was thinking of this, that while we were working on the book, a lot of the people that Trevor fought with, unfortunately, they passed away, but it wasn't necessarily, they didn't go in the middle of the night while they were sleeping. And, and I think that one thing that was important for Trevor was to memorialize their efforts, their bravery, their courage, and hopefully we did them a little bit of justice in the book.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that comes through loud and clear in the narrative, and in fact, there may be some parallels, not completely apt, but if you think about it, those two prisoners in solitary in IK-12, unknown to the world, but you saw how they helped you and helped fellow people, and then ultimately sacrificing themselves. You saw them when they were really looked like they were on their last legs. Similarly, with your colleagues in Team Rogue, they're not going to be getting decorations from the U.S. government necessarily, maybe from the Ukrainian government, but for several of them, Super Dave, the Americans who served over there, it's not as though they're going to be recognized. Maybe they will, who am I to say? But they're not going to be lionized as heroes here in the United States, even though you saw the heroic work they were doing, their heroism and the work they were doing to defend people that had been assaulted.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that, you know, they won't receive that type of recognition, but, you know, for those of us who knew those guys, you know, they're never going to die. That's always going to live on.
Yeah. So before we turn to the audience questions, one final question. I'm asked all the time, and you have much more experience than I and could provide a more fitting answer. Is Ukraine losing? Can Ukraine win? Tell us about your big picture thoughts now, looking at this battle that's being fought every day as we speak. Put the war in context. You've been there, you've been on the front lines, you've engaged with the Ukrainians, you've engaged in combat with the Russians. Tell us what your sense of this war is now that we're in, coming up within a couple of weeks of the 4-year anniversary.
It's certainly changed since I've been there. The war in Ukraine is extremely dynamic, so, you know, as time progresses, there's, you know, whole different doctrines that are built, not just inside of the Ukraine-Russia war, but in warfare as a whole. So, you know, we've seen some of that with, like, the drone warfare. You know, as I talk to those guys I still know who are on the ground, Ukraine is losing ground. It's losing it very slowly, but it's difficult to maintain the momentum to keep up that level of defense. And I think, you know, I don't think it's inevitable that Ukraine will lose, but I think it is inevitable if the United States doesn't help.
Questions? I think we have a mic here. Please join in the conversation. Come forward and maybe identify yourself and ask a question.
Elena Budovskaya, teaching Russian and Ukrainian here. So my question is, you were released in April, the war started end of February. If you had contact with other inmates within this month, what was their view of the war?
I can tell you that, you know, the war started in February, and this is a whole part of the book that's in there about basically Russian propaganda. But when Russia invaded Ukraine, you know, there was this. I'll just tell you this story. I'll try to make this as quick as possible. Basically, on the one day that I was out of solitary confinement for 2 weeks, they would send me back about every 15 days, sometimes a month, sometimes 10 days for 1 day to the barracks. In the barracks, there was a TV. So I watched Russia invade Ukraine on the TV. Maybe, I think a month, 2 months after this, you know, that was when the massacres had occurred in Bucha, and they were clearly responding to this, the Russian TV media, state-sponsored TV media. So they had a whole episode about how no one in Bucha had died. All of the bodies were dummies, or they were actors on a British film set, and that no one had died there. So they went through this whole episode for about 20 minutes. Next episode came on after a 3-minute commercial break. And during that episode, they argued that the Ukrainian neo-Nazi nationalist forces had killed all of the people in Bucha because they wanted to side with the Russian military. And my thinking was, wow, okay, that was like really dumb to run those next to each other. Obviously, no one's going to believe that. But, you know, the reaction in that room was these Russians were sitting there and they were outraged. And they said, how could the Ukrainians do that? And I said, guys, and they looked at me and I said, 3 minutes ago, we watched a whole episode that said no one died and they were all dummies. And they said, yeah. And I said, and right now they said the Ukrainians killed all of them. And they said, yeah. And I said, how could both of those possibly be true? And they went, well, whatever, let's kill them anyway. So that seemed to be the point of view of most Russians there at the time, unfortunately.
C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast.
Trevor, good to see you. I had a question about, you said, it's been a few years since you had been there. You talked to people still there. What do you think the future of the impact of the foreign fighter and like the International Legion aspect is in Ukraine, and if it can be doing more, or if it is doing just exactly what it can or should be doing in Ukraine?
I think, and to go back to Ambassador Sullivan's question, probably didn't answer that all the way, but as far as foreign fighters being utilized, I think the main Directorate of Intelligence could have done a lot better job with that, with selecting the types of operations they wanted to use us for, sometimes dealing with equipment, although that was usually good. As war changes there, I think those types of operations are going to also change for foreigners, and largely already have. But with support declining from Western countries to Ukraine, the presence of foreign fighters there has also, unfortunately, declined. And, the other thing you have to think about is, in some of these units, in the units that I served in, we had about a 90 to 95% casualty rate. That's not killed in action, but killed in action or wounded in action. And it's hard to replace that number of troops that have, Western training and experience.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lucas with the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. First, thanks for writing the book, Trevor. It's great to hear your story. I'd like to ask, is there anything you or your comrades on the front line want Americans to know about the Russian military and the behavior of Russian troops?
Yeah, I would tell you, I'll just give you one example of something that I saw on an assault in Ukraine. So we had been tasked with infiltrating Russian lines and then flanking and destroying Russian defensive positions south of Klishivka. And during that assault, we overran multiple Russian bunkers and defensive positions and destroyed those and burned them out. But during that operation, as we were going through there, inside of one of the trash piles, they have piles of trash next to where their defensive positions are located. Inside of one of those trash piles was the body of one of their own comrades that they had just thrown into the trash. And they slept maybe 10 meters away from that, and it smelled like death everywhere. So, this is bad to say, but it was very easy to dehumanize Russian troops there because of, kind of this inhuman behavior that we saw there on the battlefield.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Matthew. I'd like to thank you for coming. I have a few questions. It's a two-part question. First, I was wondering what your metric of retribution was. Like, did you come in with the mindset that, like, A, I need to, say, kill more people, like, I need to kill 2 people to even it out, or, like, cause X amount of damage, and then B, kind of to follow up on this, like, idea of dehumanization and, like, the barrack story you said, you mentioned this kind of temptation into propaganda that the Russian soldiers had, but obviously the Russian citizens have. To an extent, someone could argue that the inability to, decipher one from the other kind of almost makes them like animal-like, in unable to form logical thoughts. Like, what are your thoughts with, like, A, like, this establishing a metric for retribution, but B, like, being able to humanize, like, Russian civilians that, although they're not, say, fighting, they're being complacent?
Yeah, I would say, when I went there, I didn't have a definitive kind of metric for retribution. There was no, I didn't go in there with any specific, milestone to check off of a checklist. And I ended up not even needing that because my first night there in Donbass, when I got to the safe house, that's when I really felt like I could heal. So when I got there and I knew, okay, I've taken this agency back from the Russians, I've made it all the way here, that was the retribution in itself. It was, you know, you didn't break me, I came back here to fight you, and whatever happened after that, if I was killed, you know, if I lived, it didn't matter because I had made it there. So that's what ended up being, you know, the real retribution, even before I had participated in my first combat mission. And to the second part of your question, you know, I think it's a difficult situation. It's hard for Americans to kind of fathom the position that regular Russian civilians are in, because we don't live in the same type of environment that they do. So once you go there, you live there for a while, you start to understand that everything that they have in their world is completely inundated with this state-sponsored propaganda, which there's really no way to escape from. And even if, you know, you're one of them who says, oh, I'm gonna go use a VPN, I'm gonna look at these things and get the real news, you never really know what narrative is correct. So, you know, it was, on the one hand, easy for me to see why some of them were making the wrong decisions. And on the other hand, you know, that ultimately came down to being their choice.
Thank you.
Hey, Trevor. So I have a question. I guess all of us can tell people that are roughly detained whatever they want to hear, like support and everything, but coming from your lived experience, what would you say if you could go back to Russia and look at these people that are still there and live in this shared experience?
I would tell them that you have to hang on. You have to reach out to your family, to your friends, to anyone that you can, and they are going to have to, you know, they're going to have to fight. You're not going to be able to affect any change on your own. If I had just resisted the Russian government and I had fought like that, you know, I would, well, realistically, I would be dead now. If it wasn't for what my parents did. And, you know, my parents were very smart about that, how they did it, using the news media, using John Franks with all of his contacts, you know, reaching out to our congressmen, to the Senate, and, you know, that campaign that they launched ultimately culminated in them meeting with the President of the United States, with President Biden, and he's the one who makes ultimately the decision about the exchanges. So I would just say, you know, you're in for a long ride, but that, you know, you can make a difference, but you have to be dedicated. My dad moved to Russia, to Moscow, whenever I was in prison there, and he lived there for a year. He went to, you know, harass Ambassador Sullivan and and all of the State Department staff there, and you know, if he hadn't have done that, then I don't know what would have happened.
Thank you very much for being here this evening. My question, you talked a little bit about the perspective of some of the people you were fighting with, about why isn't the United States doing more, and then we also talked at the very end about, you know, will Ukraine lose the war or not? What do you think needs to be happening right now from the United States and a lot of our partners to make sure that Ukraine doesn't lose the war, and then what do you think is the most optimistic or maybe realistic outcome, even if they do everything they should?
Well, I'll start that off by saying, you know, what we can do now is kind of going to be a lot more than what would have been needed if we would have supported them at the beginning. So I think, you know, that was a mistake that, you know, was a mistake of multiple administrations now, in not providing a massive amount of aid at the beginning when it was needed. So, you know, the longer you wait, the less effective each, you know, package of support is going to be. I would say, you know, Ukraine definitely needs air defense systems, artillery support, long-range artillery support. The intelligence gathering is extremely important. But the other thing is that Ukraine needs to not be limited by the United States on what targets they're deciding to strike. So, you can give them as many munitions as they want, but if they don't have the ability to use those on targets that are going to hurt Russia strategically, then it doesn't matter what kind of weapons that you send to them. As far as where I see that going, I see that going one of two ways, and that will depend heavily on how the U.S. responds to that situation.
Thank you.
Trevor, congratulations on your book. You talked about, when you met with Ambassador Sullivan, how important it was to you to protect the reputation and the image of the United States. How important was your heritage as a Marine during your detention, and how did that affect you while you were detained in your actions?
I think it was extremely important. My background as a Marine, our ethos there, and our motto, always faithful. I think those things were instrumental in kind of teaching me how to fight that campaign of resistance without giving in, and that was something that I constantly thought about, as I'm sure that you did when you were also wrongfully detained.
I know I can speak from personal experience that that the Russians, particularly Russians in government, didn't really understand what the Marines were about. And I learned that because Paul Whelan would always complain to me that when he was being interrogated by the FSB, and they would bring out the Army Field Manual and start it, because they thought he was a brigadier general in the Marine Corps, and they were asking him about Army doctrine, and he kept telling them, I'm a Marine, and they thought it was just an evasion by him. So, sorry.
Hi, Trevor. My question is, from your perspective, and from the perspective of sort of your comrades, whether they be GWAT vets or volunteers in Kurdistan, just sort of how unique and unprecedented is the nature and character of warfare on the front lines in Ukraine right now?
I can only tell you from my experience. I had been a contractor in Afghanistan. I did not see any heavy combat there. We would occasionally take IDF, but even with our guys that had been in Baghdad or Fallujah or Marja, from talking to them, I asked them that same question, and their response was, when I asked, did you ever see anything, that, and they said, dude, are you serious?
Yeah,
and
it's very different than the American experience. I mean, you can break, let's say, Afghanistan down into two phases. The long kind of occupation phase, it's very different from that. But it's also very different from, what the Special Forces units did in the first 6 months or so. I mean, one of the closest parallels you can come up with is imagine the first year and a half or so of World War I with drones. So, I mean, it's just so much artillery, it's so much death and destruction, it's amazing.
It depends too heavily on what area you're operating in. So, the South could be completely different than in Donbass, and Donbass could be completely different than, parts of Kharkiv. But overall, just the intensity and how kinetic combat is there, and not even just that, but just, the length of that intensity. I don't think, that we've had anything similar to that in a long time.
Thank you.
A couple of quick fire questions. How's your Russian? Have you kept it up?
Кажется, что не очень хорошо.
Oh. Say what?
I said it seems not so good.
Sorry.
Hi, my name is Jason. I'm a U.S. Air Force veteran, and I wanted to ask, what do you think Putin's real red line is? Because he's gotten hit with the ATACMS, Moscow's been hit by drones and all other sorts of, tactics. So what is his real red line? Because he keeps saying, I'm going to use nukes. He's, used IRBMs on various cities. What do you think what is his red line? Like, where is he actually going to deploy nuclear weapons if it gets to that point, if America does keep aiding Ukraine?
Sure. My personal opinion on this, obviously, Ambassador Sullivan is much more qualified than me to answer that, but my personal opinion is that red line is much more of, an attempt at deterrence than it is an actual red line. And I think that through now 2 administrations having based strategic decisions on that imaginary red line has seriously hurt Ukraine's combat capabilities.
We should hear from the ambassador because he would have a perspective
Well,
on this.
I couldn't agree more. I thought the only, and I base this on my conversations with my former colleagues at UCOM and at SACUR, Chairman Milley and so forth. There was never, I didn't see any tactical or strategic benefit for them to use a nuclear weapon on what Putin himself describes as, their heartland of the Kievan Rus empire. I did think they might use a chemical weapon, and the one time I thought they might, when Mariupol was under siege in April and May of 22, and the Ukrainian military forces fell back on this big steel factory, the Azovstal Steel Works, which had been just rendered rubble, and the landscape looked like Stalingrad in January 1943. And the Ukrainians were dug in. They had their families there underground with them. And I thought that, maybe the way Assad used chemical weapons in Syria, he might use chemical weapons to spare his own troops having to go in and clean out that massive urban landscape, and he didn't. So but it has been, as you said, Trevor, it has been a deterrent that the American, when I was ambassador, it was the 2 principal concerns of the Biden administration were, first, nuclear war with Russia. Second, war with Russia generally. The concern was that the Russians would strike NATO territory, and then Article 5 would be invoked and would be in a shooting war with the Russians. So the instructions from the president were, do everything we can do everything we can do to support Ukraine, but don't get us into a war with Russia. Well, one more question. Okay, so Jim, I hope you'll agree with me. Probably not the typical profile for a Georgetown undergraduate, you think?
Probably more like the grad students.
Even there. How's life been? Now back here in the Ivy halls of Georgetown University, how's life as a student here?
It's good. It's challenging, especially advanced Russian. I didn't realize that was going to be like my hardest subject. I had learned Russian well, but apparently not
Russian.
that well. So that's been an experience, but getting to know all of the students here and getting to just be part of this program here is beautiful.
And then what next after this education at Georgetown and all the experience you've had?
Well, hopefully, whenever one of these students are my future employer, they'll remember I signed their book.
Well, first, I can't end without mentioning finally your parents who did so much to support you, your family, your sister Taylor, who has over there. What an extraordinary family you have, and it comes through in the book. I mean, there are these short chapters that are statements by your parents. And as I said at the outset, what I learned as ambassador in dealing with wrongfully detained Americans is it's just not the person behind bars, it's their family too. And as important as it was for me, for Americans, the embassy to go see you in prison, to reassure you, it was just as important, if not more so, to reassure your parents that you weren't forgotten. So thank you for all you did. I would love you forever. Jim, final thoughts before we give the final word to Trevor?
The only thing I'd say is every time you talk about school and classes, it sounds a lot harder than what you just said. Let that go.
Wow, thanks for diving me out.
Final word, Trevor.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, you know, if you read this book and you're looking for some kind of lesson in there to take away, it would just be, you know, the human element of it. And if, you know, you go on from here to go work at Foggy Bottom or Langley or the White House or something, and you've got that policy memo sitting on your desk, just take a minute to step into the shoes of somebody inside of that, you know, that briefing or that statistic, and really think about what that person is going through. And when you step back out of that, back in your office, just think about, does this policy help people? Does this policy do the absolute best job that it can? And is this the most ethical policy that it can be? And I think if you're able to do that, then, you know, you're not only going to be a much better policymaker, but a much better person.
Well said.
Thanks for listening to Afterwards from C-SPAN. You can watch more conversations with authors like this one every Sunday on C-SPAN 2's Book TV. Book TV and all the C-SPAN networks are now available to watch live on YouTube TV. Learn more at tv.youtube.com. And next week on Afterwards, Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. and author Thomas Chatterton Williams talk about the social justice movements of 2020 and Williams' book titled Summer of Our Discontent: The Age of Certainty and the Demise of Discourse.